Welcome to Thoughts on Thursday. I'm Dr. Al Freeman, Director of LCMS School Ministry, and it is a joy today to kick off our new Zoom series on Thoughts on Thursday. Today is all about accommodations. I'm here with Dr. BJ Weimer and Kathy Krause, and I will introduce both of them in a second, a little bit more. But let's open in prayer, and then after that, introduction of BJ and Kathy. And then they will give us a great presentation and some discussion on accommodations today. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this wonderful and glorious day as we come off of celebrating significant church events the past couple of days as well. We ask you be with us today, be with BJ and Kathy as they present, be with us all as we discover ways and opportunities to help those in our classroom to achieve, to excel, to succeed, knowing that each one is a unique gift from you and that we all are fearfully and wonderfully made and in your image, and that you have called us to help those in our classrooms and beyond to reach their potential that is God-given. Help us always in all that we do to especially spread that gospel message and allow them to know you as Lord and Savior, and to know that they are created in his image and that they all have wonderful gifts and opportunities to serve him ahead of them in their lives. Be with all of our Lutheran schools, all of our church workers as they carry out your precious gospel message each and every day. In your son's name we pray. Amen. So with us is Dr. BJ Weimer, who is, and I'll read her bios here. We've got two just outstanding individuals to discuss over the next three Zoom sessions, events that we have. BJ has served in the field of special education for 46 years as a teacher, administrator, and university instructor. She has worked with students from preschool through graduate levels, but her favorites are the fifth graders, which that might be a discussion question for later as well. Why fifth graders? She is a national teacher trainer and a professional senior consultant for the Spire Reading Intervention Program. Has a passion for students and their families, which has led her in many volunteer capacities, including the National Board of Directors for the Learning Disabilities Association for many years. She is currently the program administrator for LACE Special Education, which is based in St. Louis. And LACE serves really all over the Missouri district, a lot of programs in the greater St. Louis area and beyond, but certainly throughout the Missouri district. She is happily married, which is always great, right? And as a mother of three growing daughters and a proud grandma of four. We're just having those discussions before of BJ growing up or having a young family in her neighborhood and now seeing the neighborhood change, and she and her husband having a great time with that. Kathy has 30 years of teaching and administrative experience in both Lutheran and public education. Currently a director for the Lutheran Special Education Ministries, which many of us in Lutheran schools know, as they are in several states throughout the United States, serving our Lutheran schools. She has a national, international focus on supporting students with learning challenges in non-public schools and Christian churches. Special education teaching experience from preschool to university. Develops and presents professional development topics at schools and district teacher conferences related to assisting students who are academically challenged. Blessed mom of two and a grandma to three beautiful and brilliant young women. It is great to have BJ and Kathy with us. Obviously, a wealth of knowledge, experience, and everything else. So first, a great big thank you to both of you. When I asked you, would you do this? And both willingly said, absolutely, this is great because we know we are helping all of those who serve the children. So with that, BJ and Kathy have a little bit of a PowerPoint discussion for us. We will then have time for question answer session after the PowerPoint is finished. At which time, it's always good to put those questions in chat. Feel free to do that as the PowerPoint goes. You don't have to save the questions for the end. Feel free at any time if something sparks a thought, an idea, a question you may have, put it forth, and we'll cover all those as well.
There it goes.
Okay. So the who and why. So let's look at this for a minute. General education teachers accommodate for all students in their classroom. Doesn't matter what their needs are or who they are. It's very, very obvious that sometimes there's a buffet of options that they allow students to choose from. But then there are those students that usually fall under the heading of those students that BJ and I look at and work with, students that might have some different need than our typically developing students, such as maybe attention deficit, anxiety, or actually a disability that's been actually diagnosed. So what we look at then is an accommodation plan that we can put together for those students. So this accommodation plan can support the needs that these students might have. But we want to make sure that we have documentation and data to support the reason for an accommodation. So perhaps there is a physician's note that talks about a child that has an anxiety disorder, or maybe a diagnosis from a public school or an agency that a child has a learning disability in any number of different areas. So then we look at writing a plan that outlines the needs and the reason for these accommodations to be met. And we always want to make sure that those of us who write the accommodation plan speak with the parents ahead of time, and also with the teachers that are going to be enacting these accommodation plans in their classroom. And lastly, we always want to make sure if there are any accommodations made for a student, that we make sure that is documented on a report card as time goes on. So let's now look at the difference between two very similar words that are used interchangeably sometimes. So the word accommodation and modification are often used synonymously, and we must make a distinct difference between those two because they are completely different. An accommodation is how a child is changed in their learning environment. How do we change learning for a child that needs an accommodation plan? A modification is what a student is changed for their learning experience. So let's look at a little bit of a difference here. An accommodation plan might be that a student could do an oral presentation rather than a written one. It could be a group of matching areas in a test that are chunked rather than a large list that can be confusing for somebody who has processing issues. Now, on the other hand, a modification is actually changing possibly the curriculum or the expectations you have for that particular child. And a simple example of that could be if you have a page of multiplication problems that students are supposed to work with. A modification for a child that has issues might be that they only do single-digit multiplication while the majority of the class is doing double-digit modifications. So now if we look at a chart that shows us a little bit about adaptations. So in this chart, you'll see a number of different areas. There is definitely one area that is a modification, and that could be the one down at the right-hand bottom corner, a substitute curriculum. That is a definite modification. But these other areas are usually accommodations, such as changing the number or items that a child must complete, the amount of time. Many issues can happen with children that have anxiety, that they cannot be within a time limit. Maybe extending that time limit would be an accommodation that was helpful for them. Input and output, those two areas speak to how a presentation is made. Maybe input, you use a lot more hands-on or visual accommodations rather than just doing lectures. Output, again, maybe you want a child to give a certain report on a topic. Could that child not do it in an oral format rather than a written format? So these are a number of different areas that we could look at as time goes on for different accommodations. But again, you must look at the difference between what an accommodation is as opposed to a modification. So another issue that I really would like everybody to understand, in the public district, a 504 plan is usually something that is put together for a student that might need extra assistance. But please understand that this is a legally binding document. And you can see there when it was enacted way back in 1973, but it is legally binding. I would, and we rather, would like to strongly encourage you not to use the numbers 504 on any accommodation plan that you do, but actually use an accommodation plan. It provides the same type of purpose. It allows students with learning difficulties to have an accommodation as opposed to their typically developing peers, but it is more of a moral responsibility than that of a legal responsibility. And should you want a sample of an accommodation plan, we would be happy to send that out to you so that you could put your own logo on it for your students in your building. And now let's look at some rationale, BJ.
Okay, so why have accommodations and what's the purpose behind them? Well, what they are not is just to make homework or tests easier, right? And they aren't intended just to ensure that our students' grades can be improved. And there are sometimes we have those conversations. But while they are used for learning and for assessment, it's really just about leveling. It's all about leveling that playing field for our students and leveling for everybody. So without accommodations, many of our students who struggle due to their learning differences, due to their social, emotional needs as well, various other circumstances can occur. They may not be able to access their grade level instruction. They may not be able to fully participate on the assignments and the assessments that they're given and keep up with their peers for that reason. For example, you have the student with dyslexia who can't read the word problems in math, but they do have the ability to solve that problem if they just knew what the problem said. Or you have that child who's so completely disorganized, they can't complete their tasks. To get the task completed, to get the work completed during the morning. But if they had a checklist, then she could get everything done and know what she was missing. So by addressing those barriers, addressing those challenges that a child has in the learning process, then the accommodations actually create better access for these students. And that's what we're looking at. So basically, an effective accommodation will help students better access their learning, better access being able to complete tests. And basically, it's going to help reduce, even eliminate for some students eventually, the effects of a student's disability. It'll help them, and it could allow them to then demonstrate what they really know, what they can do, what they understand, the skills they've actually mastered. And in that process, they can then complete the same assignments, hopefully that others in their class, their peers, can do as well. Now, then on the next slide, you're going to see a great illustration of how this works when you're in a classroom with really diverse abilities.
So this is an illustration that I use quite frequently when I do a professional development with teachers and administrators. I think this is very indicative of the difference between equality and equity. So in the first illustration, you see three young ones wanting to watch a baseball game, and everything's equal with them, is it not? There's a fence there that prohibits almost anybody from seeing over it. But in the first illustration, they all have equal access, supposedly, because they all have one box to stand on. Well, it's fine for the tall person, and actually the middle-sized child, it's okay. But that little short person, kind of like me, would never be able to see over it, even with one box, trying to look through a knothole. So now in the second middle illustration, this is equity. This is giving a student what is necessary to help them achieve success. So the first tallest child does not need a box at all. The middle child only needs one, but look at the short person. He needs two. And now all three of them are able to watch the baseball game. But now in the very last illustration, look how wonderful this is, because the barrier has been removed completely. And how great is it? Could we remove any kind of learning barriers that we have for our students of any shape, size, or learning difficulties? So just something that you're certainly welcome to use when you talk to parents or a group of other administrators or teachers that want to make sure that everything is equal. And let's use the word equity better than equality.
Love that picture. So frequently, generally we categorize our accommodations into 4 groups. And we tend to look at lesson presentation. We look at how the student will respond to the materials that we're going to use. We look at timing and scheduling. We look at the setting in which the learning or the testing as well takes place. For today's conversation, we've actually expanded this a little bit to look more specifically at assignments and instruction as well, and at the testing. We're also going to look at the impact that a student's social and emotional behavioral needs take on in the classroom setting. And then we're going to look at selecting it and think about too that selecting accommodations should always be part of that IEP process or the accommodation plan for students. And we need to ask some really specific questions in that process. Now, some of the questions we're going to look at are going to include looking at their current strengths, their needs. We're going to ask what type of specialized instruction is needed for those students, because that's going to ensure that they're able to achieve grade level content. We want to ensure that. Have they used accommodations before? If they have used them, what was used? Were they successful in that process? If not, what changes need to be considered? So we'll go down and look through some of these categories. Now, thinking in terms of the presentation, many students do struggle with the way lessons are presented, especially if they've done it with just one modality. For instance, think about oral lectures that tend to use no visual supports. For instance, think about, a lot of us can probably remember a time when we've been in class as well, where we struggled to focus and follow along, especially if the material was just presented in just that modality, just orally. How much more challenging would it have been if we'd had a disability on top of that? Many students will benefit if they've had visual supports. And in getting auditory, with auditory input. So think about those that watch videos, for instance, which many students will benefit from that process. But what about providing written notes, putting them on the board, having guided notes, providing graphic organizers, simplified graphic organizers, working with models, doing things like that during lessons, especially if it's a lecture, can be really helpful in supporting auditory presentations for students. But there's other students that'll benefit too if they're encouraged to highlight key information or to use manipulatives. If you have younger students, being able to trace their letters to enhance their early learning, having other accommodations to enhance their engagement. So thinking about ways, consider finding ways to incorporate, especially again with the younger learners, where they can get their large muscle movement involved in the lesson. Standing up when they're responding or doing air writing, things like that. Any way we can get them to engage in the presentation, use multiple modalities. And the other thing to that is it's just fun. A lot of people enjoy that, whether they have that need for the accommodation or not. Thinking too about materials within the lesson, similar to what we saw under presentation, thinking about accommodations like color coding. That helps a lot for engagement. especially with kids who are tired and need to wake up in the morning. But it can also help build memory, can also involve building retention, even using in steps, helping them retain the concept of the steps in the process of something, such as highlighting with green for the first step to take, yellow for the next step. We're going to put red for the final step they're going to do in the process, know when to stop. Technology, another area I think a lot of us may be familiar with, amazing benefits that have come along over the years for students with disabilities, and it just doesn't seem to stop, and it's hard to keep up with all of it, the options that we have. But just consider even the simple ones now that we have for expressing themselves with speech to print apps, and what a difference spell check has made for those students with the legibility. With they have great thoughts to share on paper, but they struggle to convey those thoughts because they can't spell well enough for others to read them, or they're afraid to even try because their spelling is so poor and they don't want to take a chance, or they simplify their message because they can't spell the big word, or they're afraid to even try. And so they simplify everything. Similarly, there are those students who are able to work rather complex mathematical computations, but they get stuck because they can't get past the inaccuracy of their basic, Kathy mentioned earlier, the multiplication facts, and so they don't go beyond. Providing the use of a calculator to work those basic facts just allows our students the opportunity to show what they really know and can achieve. And there are a lot of students that the arithmetic of math prevents them, the inability to provide the accuracy in the arithmetic of math keeps them from doing the mathematical concepts when they do have that capability. And unfortunately, they don't achieve then. The calculator is just a tool. It's the box, if you will, from the illustration that we just saw in that previous slide. That's what they stand on to see that final answer to the problem. So materials can often get in the way of our kids. And if we can find the right materials, it's amazing what they do. Thinking then about looking too at our assignments and instruction, going a little further, fun way to really think about working with students. This is an area that can be really challenging, though, for a lot of us as teachers. I think it's a lot of fun to work with, but it can be challenging in some ways, and it can be challenging a lot for parents too. There's a lot of widely accepted accommodations under this, but it can also be an area that some of us struggle with, just because that fairness issue can kind of play in there. But think about to remember something under some of these, and these are just some common ones we've listed here. There are many, many more, but thinking about that the intent under these is to always remember that the intent of an effective accommodation is to make the task accessible to the student. Accessibility is what we're looking for here. We never want to change how they learn the lesson. It's not about changing how they learn, because that's when we get into the modification that Kathy was referring to earlier. If we start to change how we do it, I'm sorry, it is about changing. We want to make changes to how they learn the lesson. What we don't want to change is what they learn, because when we start to change the what, then we've modified the lesson. So an accommodation is to change how they learn it and not what they learn. Difference between accommodation and modification. We don't want to change the actual content of the lesson. We want our students to be able to achieve the content. So, and we also don't want to just simply give everybody who has an accommodation plan the same extended time, as it were. We don't want to give everybody the same thing. We want to, just because that's what we do, we want to make sure that we use accommodations well, that we use them because that's what that child needs. We want to specifically individualize each child's unique needs. And so we have to be very explicit about that. Looking at testing, very common area for accommodations, like accommodations in instruction. Testing accommodations can be overly used, where we tend to give the same thing to kids without necessarily being explicit about the needs for specific students. So we have to take a lot of care there to ensure they're truly a benefit to that specific student. So, and while accommodations listed on our slide here, again, are widely used, very common, That care needs to be taken to make sure that it's used in the testing to change only how the student is tested, but never what they're being measured on. So it should be how they're receiving the test, but not the material itself. For example, it may be appropriate to read the text of the word problem in math again. But for example, you've got a child who has word problems in a math section of assessment. Being able to read that aloud would be fine, but reading the decoding part of the test would not be appropriate for a third grader. So we have to be very careful with that. That becomes an accommodation. Now this slide right here is just a favorite of mine, and I asked Kathy if I could share that with you. I just love this because it is kind of a break from our norm here, but just a sweet reminder that our students also have many God-given gifts and talents that don't really need accommodations to be achieved. And we're not going to find this on any of their tests, but a lot of times we forget to remember all these, and want to keep those in mind for our students as well. And I love this piece. All right. On the social emotional piece here too, our students do need a safe, structured setting as well, in which they can receive accommodations. And students with social, emotional, or behavioral needs also need very clear, positive expectations set for them. There are many, many really good accommodations that can be in place. These have to be thought through very, very carefully. And we do have a list for you at the end that can be a help for this process. But we also need to address them. Some can be very simple. Simple things that can be considered, like the setting itself. It may be just softer lighting in a classroom. It may be variable seating options that can help with a student's needs in this area. Maybe something we don't think about, like just the olfactory, the smell of a classroom could bother some students, or the temperature setting of a room, things we often overlook. Might be something much more complex, like creating between the teacher and the student a personal cue to redirect behavior in a way that doesn't embarrass the student. Providing time in the day for check-ins with kids to see how they're doing and see if there's something that we need to provide them for additional support and various things during the day. Again, as with all the accommodations, that all of these need to be specifically chosen for each child uniquely and for the specific challenges that they have. So none of these come easy. I shouldn't say that. Sometimes they are easy, but a lot of times they do take trial and error. You have to try them, you have to reevaluate them, see what's the best match. And we'll take a look at that here as we wrap up at the end. But in the process, we do get creative too. So, and in that process, we do want to think about, and this is where it kind of gets really fun as a teacher, because getting creative, we get to really look at those unique needs of our kids. If the common everyday kinds of things don't seem to be working, we really need to stop then and think, and what's that process? Think about what the student's disability is, so that we are thinking, are we appropriate? We don't want to just do what we've done for everybody else necessarily. Then look at the specific challenge. What is it? What's the barrier? What's happening here? How is it affecting the child's learning or the assessment process for this student? And then ask yourself the questions. What is it that needs to be accomplished? What is it I'm trying to do here? What's my intent? What seems to be keeping the student from doing what I'm asking this child to do? And from there, then we can consider what could be done differently. What can be done to make that work for this student be accomplished? That's what the accommodation is going to be. What it is that I'm going to do differently. Different students in a class may have similar challenges, but need to have a different means to address that challenge. And the next slide here is just a really fun way that Kathy has found to accommodate some of these differences.
So we look at a tic-tac-toe choice board for a book report. And as I was in elementary school or teaching in elementary school, there were always book reports we had to do. But here's kind of a fun way to do it. It can be a tic-tac-toe board. Now, the middle square should always be something that is necessary for everyone to complete. So in this case, it's a poster that shows the order of events of a story. And then every child is required to do that part of the book report. Then you can see as it goes around the tic-tac-toe board, there are different options for children. This particular tic-tac-toe board has colors with it as well. You may want to think about your students in different segments. There might be some students that you know just are really not good with written language and really have a struggle with it. So maybe you might put things in a different color for those particular students. For instance, the top left corner, draw a picture of the main character. So that red color might be assigned, maybe the red and the pink colors might be assigned to those students that are better when they do something in a different modality rather than written. Or you might want to make your more advanced students do the written part of it. For instance, down in the middle section, write 2 paragraphs about the main character, or even to the right of that, write 2 paragraphs about the setting. You might want to give students choices of the different colors. It all comes to the same conclusion that the students will show their knowledge of the book report and their ability to give your teachers an idea that they have read the book, that they understand it, and they will go ahead with good comprehension of that meaning of the book if it is something that is a particular segment, such as a history story about a person in American history. So there are many, many different ways that you can use this tic-tac-toe board. This is just a small example of what was done by one particular teacher.
Now, once we have had accommodations in place, we definitely want to make sure that we evaluate them. And are they being effective? And this process can be an ongoing thing. You definitely want to have some time to see if it's being effective or not. But you also want to make sure that you at least once a year go through this process. A good time to do that is when you are having your annual IEP and accommodation plan, but you certainly can do it much sooner than that if you see it's not working. Definitely take another look at things. But we definitely don't want to be just stuck using it all the time just because we've put it in place. So it's important to remember they're not something that we want to just have it forever. The hope is that we're going to also, if we've picked an accommodation well, students are going to be learning alongside their peers. They're going to be mastering their grade level content and doing well. And it is possible in time that they will be able to drop accommodations or be able to change them and vary them and lessen them, we hope. So again, this evaluation process is important, but these are some of the key questions, and I'm sure there are many others we could be asking, but some of these things are things we need to be asking ourselves. So think about, was the accommodation used, first of all, consistently? If it wasn't, if not, it may not be, if it hasn't been used consistently, maybe it's not necessary to use it at all, or at least it would be difficult to assess its effectiveness. Did the accommodation allow that student to learn as well as their peers? That's the process. That's what we want, is that that's what it's doing. So if it wasn't doing that, then again, it hasn't probably been as effective as we wanted. Was the student able to achieve the learning objectives that we had to begin with? So one thing we want to make sure is that the accommodation is not reducing by any means the learning expectations, not giving us any false picture of what a student really can do. Again, making sure that it's not creating a modification instead of an accommodation. So that's really important. Did the accommodation make learning too easy? Or was the student still appropriately challenged? Again, we want to make sure that a student does not become dependent on the accommodation, overly dependent in any way, and never should it replace appropriate and rigorous instruction and at grade level content. If it does, it really is becoming a modification. So recognizing that difference. And there are those students that need modifications, but we just need to recognize what that difference is. And then again, finally, was the student able to fully participate as a general member of the class? So again, being very careful not to over accommodate, because that can actually end up leading to reduced learning, and we want to be really careful of that. And I think oftentimes in this situation of the student who just picks up a test and leaves the classroom without ever trying to take the test inside the classroom, without trying to do things without the accommodation. So especially as they get older, we want to try to work towards that independence without these kinds of things. So always evaluating the process.
So as we look towards some of the resources that we have here for you, three major ones that we can speak of. Learning Disabilities Association of America, which BJ has been affiliated with for many years. And they have affiliates in many of the major states around the country. And all their information is very easily accessible. Council for Exceptional Children. That's an organization that I belong to. It does usually require membership, but there are ways to get information from that section as well. The bottom one here is Understood. That is something that has been put together, and it's nonprofit, mainly for parents. But I will tell you, it's an excellent resource for teachers as well. And you see the websites down there for those three. In the next slide, some accommodations that we have used. The 4 books at the bottom are all from Hawthorne Publishing. They are phenomenal. Even though it says intervention manuals on them, they are filled with accommodations and interventions that you can use in your classroom. It is just a wonderful resource if you have a professional library in your school building. Also, up at the top, there's a PDF. Not sure whether you will be able to click on that and have it actually come up. But if not, please, our slides with our information will be at the end of this presentation, and we will send you this PDF. It is 9 pages of accommodations. So please, here are our ways of getting a hold of us, our websites, our email addresses. So please feel free to contact us if you have questions. But then, BJ, if you want to go back to the question part, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might want to put in the chat. Or if you can turn your camera on, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Al, I think if you could monitor that, that would be wonderful.
Yes, we are monitoring the chat, so if anyone would like to drop a question in there, and maybe to get us started, I've got a couple because I always have questions, you know. First, I will say this, thank you, great presentation, a lot packed into that time period. You know, I'll give a shout out as a teacher in my early years starting out. We had a fantastic special educator at our school. We had a specialized program for students with learning differences, and Irene Jaguar did an amazing job and taught me so much, and including a key element in all of this. Not only are we helping learners who maybe have differences, struggles, and looking for accommodations and other things, but all of these items translate into just really good teaching and applies to all students. So it makes us better educators when we utilize these items. And the strength of Lutheran schools too, relationships, right? We know our students, we build those relationships with the student, with the family, and those relationships help overcome a lot of these obstacles as well, where we're working together for the betterment of the student and their success. Let me ask you this, as a high school teacher, one of the things that was always a concern about having in our handbooks 504 or IEP, and you address that to accommodations, which I think is a key element for our schools to think about. But for us, one of those concerns sometimes is if we didn't label it a 504 or an IEP, it could translate to struggles in trying to get SAT extended time or accommodations for SAT or ACTs.
Yes,
A little
that
bit
is
about
very,
that.
that's the, yes, and that's one portion that I was going to bring up in the question and answer portion here, Al. Here in Michigan, the high schools that we serve here in Michigan have never had a problem with ACT or SAT having our students have an accommodation plan. However, I will couch that comment so that if you believe your district has a difference or a difficulty using just an accommodation plan, that in that high school setting, you may want to put the 504 designation on it, if that is a necessity to getting accommodations and like extended time on those ACT, SAT portions of college entrance exams.
And for us, it was always about the documentation too, right? That
That's
you know,
correct.
as long as we had really good documentation that this was consistently done and this was part of our accommodations, then we were able to at least, you know, if it got initially rejected by SAT or ACT, East Coast was always SAT, that we could appeal that and show that we had true documentation that this was consistently occurring.
Yes, and that's a good point, and that's why I would be happy to share our accommodation plan that we use at LSEM, and I have shared that in the past. All I do is take off all the logo information, and then any school can put their logo on and use it as documentation too.
Fantastic. Let me ask you just a very general question, because I think sometimes the terminology changes a little bit. What is the best way to describe it? Do we call it learning differences, learning opportunities, learning challenges? What's the best just phrasing so that we can all kind of be on the same page and not, you know, one of the struggles is always you don't want to address a child in a way that puts them already on the defensive in something, or the family, because you need to be able to work together successfully, right?
And that's a good question. Go ahead, BJ.
Well, Kathy, go. I mean, you're fine. I can get specific on later.
Sure. It's a good question because if we look at IDEA, there are specific lists of disabilities, but in speaking with a child, it's always child first language, you know, a child with a learning challenge, a child with a disability. I know even in our setting as special educators, we struggle too. Do we use the words learning disabled? Do we use the words learning challenged? Do we use the words learning difficulties? I think it's a lot of semantics, but we want parents and students to understand that the challenges that they have, especially if it's a diagnosed disability, is something that doesn't disappear, but we can learn to help them cope with it and to learn specific strategies that will help diminish or lessen the difficulty between them and their typically developing peers. So BJ, go ahead and be more specific, please.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, and that covers that in a more specific way. There are the specific and explicit diagnoses. So there are the 13 different categories under IDEA. And so when you look at a learning disability, that is a very specific diagnosis. And so when you use the word learning, a lot of people want to use the learning differences. If we use the broad term, of these students have learning differences, right? Within the broad system of our classroom, there are many learning differences. So that's happening. But there are students that have very specific learning disabilities. So that's a category within the broad umbrella of learning differences. So, but I don't get into those nuances with the parents unless we're looking at the specific diagnosis part of it. I don't think that's really necessary in terms of, we need to understand that, but we don't have to get into the weeds with it, I think, with our conversations with parents and that kind of thing. I do think it's important with older students that, and I've just dealt with this with a 13-year-old who did not know he had a learning disability and was getting accommodations, very heavy accommodations, in the 8th grade and had no idea why. And I think that is very detrimental. Unfortunately, parents were, and then we had a very good conversation, but a very honest conversation, in terms of revealing that, because that's a struggle. And that child thought he was stupid, right? And that's a child with a learning disability that was not at all, had very, very strong abilities, and with accommodations is doing well in school, but needed to understand why he needed so much support. And actually, this is a child that needed to pull back on supports, did need to be reevaluated for those supports. So, but that honest conversation needs to be had as they get older. So Kathy, as you said, students need to understand those kind of things as well, and be honest in those conversations.
And I would imagine that's something, and I'll speak to my, teaching and administrator experience. I think all those are good points. Sometimes students don't realize that, parents don't realize that, because students quite frequently will try to hide it in some way because they don't want to be different. And it could be, they might perceive it as a stigma or whatever else. And a lot of times it manifests in frustrations, right? And I don't like school, I'm frustrated here, I'm not doing well. So when we have maybe an inkling that a student is struggling, it could be related to a learning difference, but they haven't been tested, diagnosed, or anything else at that point. What's a great recommendation for a teacher to kind of put that forth and see if that's the case? Or, it may not be the case too, right? It could be something else entirely that's going on in the student's life.
Well, I would say first and foremost, if there's something that seems to be askew, different than what we see in other typically developing children. I mean, the first thing I would say to a parent is, has your child been to a physician? Do you know that your child's hearing and vision are within the normal ranges? I'd always want to look at that first. And then maybe some delicate questions, like, how are things going in the home? Do you know, as a teacher, you might know that there are problems in the home, and possibly there is a relative who is ill, and that can have all kinds of emotional effects on a student. But when it comes to the fact that a teacher might believe that a child could qualify as having a learning disability, most of our Lutheran schools do not have school psychologists on board, but they should look to their public district and ask what the procedure is for having a child go through a psychoeducational battery. But one thing that is pertinent for us as teachers in our non-public schools is to go through what's called RTI, response to intervention. So there always should be interventions put in place for a child that's struggling, to make sure that there are accommodations being made and specific interventions that are put in place before you go to a complete battery of evaluations. So we look at those types of interventions, and many public schools will demand that. They will not even do an evaluation of a child if a school has not put forth some interventions. The other option, of course, is going through medical facilities, but they are very, very costly and not always in the realm of availability to parents because of the financial burden. But public districts are mandated to serve the students within their district of non-public schools as well. So every school administrator really should look at the process that they need to go through in their public district if an evaluation seems necessary for a student.
Awesome. And, you know, as a teacher and as a former administrator, my advice too on that, so I partly asked the question for that awesome response, but then also so I could jump in here at the end, right? And that is address it with the administrator first. And
yes.
that way you're not, you know, don't blindside anyone. So if you're a teacher, I think sometimes the effort is to say, oh, I want to address this, I want to talk to the family, and don't create that situation. And then, as you said, Kathy, the public school system, they're responsible for this as well. So engage them. And I encourage all administrators, reach out to your public school people to get to know them. So that if you do have a situation like this where a teacher might think, hey, this student maybe should be tested. Let's discuss this with the family. And you already know the process that you laid out so eloquently there, that you're already engaged with the public school and you don't have to figure out, oh, who am I calling? How do we get this done? Where is it done? And all these steps. Get to know those people, right? Because I want to get to know you too as a non-public school administrator, because I know they're required to support you as well through this.
Yeah, very good point, Al.
Maybe just one last question here from me, because I'm just always full of questions. A lot of our schools don't have support, right? You mentioned that. You don't have a school psychologist. You don't have a special education educator. You don't have LSEM in your school. You don't have LACE in your school. And maybe, you know, you're a principal who's teaching a quarter time and trying to be an administrator, and your teachers are trying to do these things. How does it happen maybe in a situation like that where, well, no, I have 22 kids in my class and now I have to have accommodations for 4 of them, and I've got to do lesson prep and grade papers and do all these things. It could be a little bit overwhelming if I've got 4 students and each one has a little bit different accommodation. Any advice how to make that work successfully?
Many accommodations are not necessarily time consuming things. And if we think about universal design for learning, UDL, and of course we have now universal design for assessments and such as well, you're going to find that, you know, that takes off of what we have for universal design from architecture, just the cutouts in our curbs and things that have helped everyone. And that's, if we can think about that, and many things that we've done in teaching, many of the things that you'll see in accommodations are things that are good for the entire class, are things that can easily be woven into the classroom presentation, a multi-sensory presentation, you know, having manipulatives alongside, having notes, having guided notes, or having everybody do stand-up kinds of activities. That's just good, fun lesson engagement for the entire class. So while it's accommodating some, it can benefit all. So there are many kinds of things that you can do that'll be an accommodation, again, what some students need. And again, it might be something that some students, it could be, for instance, a graph paper, that some students may need graph paper to organize their writing in math. If they need it, they go over and they grab it. If they don't need it, they don't use it. So it's just something you can implement into the classroom, but there are a lot of things that the student that doesn't need it doesn't pull it. So many things don't take extra time and planning for a teacher. It's the time that it takes to plan it, to prepare for it, to have it available, to think through the process. What do I need in my classroom? What do I have to have available? You know, that kind of thing. There are a few other things that I may need to take the time to plan for some of these things, but once it's in place, it doesn't need to necessarily take a lot of time from the class. And there will be exceptions to that, obviously, but a lot of good planning can just be part of that universal design within your classroom. And I think there is that push to that in many, many classes today, which again, that go back to the picture that Kathy, that she put up. That's the equity that we can put into our design that just works for everybody.
I think that's awesome, and absolutely. Again, as a classroom teacher and starting out, that was always some of my question. How can I do this? I got classes and they're changing and bells and all this stuff. And what you find out is it isn't as complicated as you might think it to be initially. Your reaction, oh, how am I going to handle all this? And what you find out is, no, it's very manageable and very doable. And you take part in the joy of not only seeing the success of the students, but the learning differences, but the entire class. And you start to really figure out how to become a better teacher in many ways too, that I'm hitting so many different segments and learning styles and everything else. So, and that's what we're after, right? We want to see our students grow spiritually, academically, socially. We get that opportunity to experience that with them and those successes. So thank you very much to BJ and Kathy for a great presentation today. We will be back with you with 2 more presentations. We have one coming up in December and one coming up in January, so please watch for those. All of these presentations are housed on LCMS School Ministry YouTube channel. Is that right, Will?
YouTube, Facebook, and X.
YouTube, Facebook, and X. I will never get used to calling X, not Twitter, but
formerly
X,
known as
yes.
Twitter.
Yes. So great material. We are working on the next 2 presentations. So if anyone out there has any suggestions, something that might help you out as an administrator, as a classroom teacher, please let us know. And Kathy and BJ are happy to take that in different directions, because this is made to help you help your students and all of your students so that they can achieve success and be all that God has called them to be. I will ask BJ and Kathy just to stay on for a second. Blessings to everyone else. Blessings on your day as we enter into the month of November. We give thanks for all of you and the work that you do each and every day to spread the gospel message.